Evermere's defender. Condemned as a traitor's daughter, Lady Beatrice of Westmere had spent years hiding in the countryside. But when Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's executioner, finally found her, he did not raise his blade. Instead, he watched her in silence before murmuring, "You should already be dead, my lady. Tell me, why do I wish to let you live?" Chapter 1. The Executioner's Gaze. The air hung thick and heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Beatrice knelt, her fingers digging into the cold soil, a desperate prayer clinging to her lips like the morning mist that shrouded the valley. She'd been tending the small, hidden garden, a patch of fragile life carved out of the wilderness, when the sound of snapping twigs shattered the fragile peace. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She knew, without looking, that she was no longer alone. For years, she had lived with this fear, a constant shadow at her heels. The fear of discovery, the fear of the king's justice, the fear of the executioner's blade. Her father, Lord Alaric of Westmere, had been branded a traitor, his name forever stained with the accusation of conspiring against King Edmund. He had been dragged from their ancestral home, his pleas of innocence echoing unanswered in the stone halls, and publicly beheaded. Beatrice, only 17 at the time, had been spared the same fate, thanks only to the intervention of a sympathetic maidservant who had smuggled her out of the castle under the cover of darkness. Now, years later, the past had finally caught up with her. Slowly, she rose, brushing the dirt from her simple woolen kirtle. She turned, her gaze lifting to meet the eyes of the man who stood at the edge of the clearing. He was tall, a figure carved from granite and steel, his presence radiating a chilling authority. Sunlight glinted off the polished surface of his breastplate, the only bright spot in the somber scene. His face, framed by dark, shoulder-length hair streaked with silver, was hard, unyielding, etched with the lines of countless battles and untold sorrows. He wore the sigil of the king, a golden lion rampant on a field of crimson emblazoned on his surcoat. This was no ordinary knight. This was Sir Roderick Locksley, the king's executioner, the man known throughout the land as the Shadow of the Gallows. The man who carried out the king's grim justice, his name whispered in fear and revulsion. The man who had swung the axe that had severed her father's head. Beatrice's breath hitched in her throat. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed the pleas she would make, the arguments she would offer. But now, faced with the reality of her impending death, all words deserted her. She stood frozen, her gaze locked with his, a strange, unsettling calm settling over her. Sir Roderick did not move. He simply watched her, his eyes, the color of a stormy sea, filled with an intensity that made her skin prickle. He did not draw his sword. He did not speak. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, broken only by the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant cry of a hawk. Beatrice found her voice, a mere whisper at first, then gaining strength. "You have found me, Sir Roderick. I am Beatrice of Westmere." She lifted her chin, a flicker of defiance in her eyes. She would not beg. She would not cower. Even if it was the last thing she did, she would meet her fate with the dignity befitting a daughter of Westmere. He continued to observe her, his gaze unwavering. It felt less like the gaze of a predator and more curious, as if he were studying a rare specimen, something he couldn't quite categorize. The tension in the clearing was almost a physical entity, a suffocating weight pressing down on Beatrice's chest. She had expected rage, perhaps a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes at finally capturing his prey. But there was nothing of the sort, only this unnerving, silent scrutiny. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and resonant, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You should already be dead, my lady." The words were not a question, but a statement of fact, a cold, hard truth that hung in the air between them. He took a step closer, the movement slow and deliberate, like a wolf approaching its quarry. Beatrice held her ground, though her heart pounded against her ribs with renewed force. She forced herself to meet his gaze, refusing to show any outward sign of fear. I was spared, she replied, her voice surprisingly steady. By the kindness of a servant. He raised a skeptical eyebrow. Kindness or treachery?
Kindness, she insisted.
She believed in my father's innocence. She believed in my innocence. Sir Roderick continued his slow advance, stopping just a few feet away from her. The scent of leather and steel, a scent she had always associated with power and authority, now filled her nostrils, a chilling reminder of her precarious situation. He studied her face, his eyes lingering on the faint scar above her left eyebrow, a memento of a childhood fall, a mark that identified her as surely as any royal decree. Your father confessed, he said, his voice devoid of emotion. He admitted his guilt before the entire court. Beatrice flinched at the words, the old wound of her father's betrayal reopening with fresh pain. He was tortured, she whispered, her voice cracking. Forced to confess to crimes he did not commit. Sir Roderick remained silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. Then he spoke again, the words unexpected, unsettling. Tell me, why do I wish to let you live? The question hung in the air, heavy and laden with unspoken meaning. It was not a reprieve. Not yet. It was a challenge. A test. A riddle wrapped in the guise of a death sentence. Beatrice stared at him, her mind reeling. Why would he want to let her live? He was the king's executioner, his duty to carry out the king's justice, not to question it. He had no reason to spare her, no reason to show her any mercy. She searched his face, trying to decipher the meaning behind his words, trying to understand the strange flicker of something in his eyes. Was it pity? Curiosity? Or something else entirely, something she couldn't quite name? The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from a distant village. The sun, momentarily obscured by clouds, broke through again, casting long shadows across the clearing. Beatrice knew that her life hung in the balance, suspended on the answer to his impossible question. She had to choose her words carefully, her every syllable measured, her every breath a prayer. The fate of a traitor's daughter rested on the whim of the king's executioner, and the answer to a question that defied all logic. She took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his unflinching. I do not know, Sir Roderick. But I believe there is more to justice than the swing of an axe. Chapter 2. Whispers of Treason. The air grew colder, a sharp contrast to the brief burst of sunlight that had warmed the clearing. Roderick's gaze remained fixed on Beatrice, his expression unreadable. Her answer, a fragile tendril of defiance and hope, hung between them, untested and vulnerable. She could feel the weight of his scrutiny, the silent assessment that would determine her fate. More to justice than the swing of an axe, he repeated, his voice low, almost a murmur. He turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the small, meticulously tended garden. The herbs rosemary, thyme, chamomile, and others she had painstakingly cultivated swayed gently in the breeze, their fragrant leaves releasing their subtle scents into the air. He seemed to notice, for the first time, the small details of her hidden life. The worn leather-bound book of herbal remedies resting on a weathered tree stump. The carefully stacked firewood. The small, crudely built shelter that served as her home. You have lived here for how long? He asked, his voice losing some of its harshness. 5 years, Beatrice replied, her voice barely above a whisper. 5 years since Westmere. She couldn't bring herself to say the words, my father's execution. The memory was still too raw, too painful. He nodded slowly, his eyes returning to her face. 5 years. Living like a fugitive. A shadow. Always looking over your shoulder. She met his gaze, her chin lifting slightly. I have survived, she said, her voice gaining a measure of strength. I have learned to live off the land, to be self-sufficient, and to avoid detection, he added, a hint of something in his voice. It wasn't admiration, not exactly, but perhaps a grudging respect. The respect one warrior might give another, even an enemy. Beatrice said nothing. She knew that her survival had been a combination of luck, cunning, and the kindness of a few scattered souls who had dared to offer her aid, risking their own lives in the process. Roderick took a step closer, the movement slow and deliberate. He stopped just a few feet away, close enough for her to see the fine lines etched around his eyes, the subtle scars that spoke of battles fought and wounds endured. He was not as young as she had first thought, perhaps in his late 30s or early 40s. Old enough to have seen the horrors of war, old enough to have carried out the king's justice countless times. "The king believes you are dead," he said, his voice low and confidential. "A report was sent to him, years ago, stating that you had succumbed to illness, a fever contracted in the marshes." Beatrice's eyes widened. "A report?" He nodded. "A deliberate falsehood, crafted by someone who wished to protect you." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "Who was it, my lady? Who risked their life to save yours?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Beatrice knew that she could not reveal the truth. To do so would endanger the lives of those who had helped her. She had sworn an oath, a silent vow to protect their secrets, even at the cost of her own life. "I cannot say," she replied, her voice firm, despite the tremor in her hands. Roderick studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowed. He seemed to be weighing her words, assessing her truthfulness. Then he spoke again, his voice softer than before. "The whispers of treason, they have never truly died," he said. "Even after your father's execution, there were those who believed in his innocence. Those who claimed that he was framed, that he was a victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by his enemies." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. This was dangerous ground. To speak of such things, to even acknowledge the possibility of a conspiracy, was to risk being branded a traitor herself. And yet, she couldn't deny the truth that had haunted her for years. The truth that had kept her alive, fueled her determination to survive. "My father was a loyal subject of the king," she said, her voice filled with a quiet conviction. "He would never have betrayed his oath." Roderick said nothing, but his gaze remained fixed on her face, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He seemed to be searching for something, some hidden truth that lay buried beneath the surface of her words. He turned from her and walked to where her small fire pit lay, now just ashes and cold embers. He knelt, picking up a small, blackened piece of wood. He studied it, turned it in his calloused fingers. "You have had visitors," he said, without looking at her. Beatrice swallowed. She knew. The subtle signs. A slightly disturbed patch of earth. A broken twig. A faint scent of unfamiliar herbs. Someone had been here, recently. Someone who knew of her existence. "The villagers," she answered, choosing her words cautiously. "Sometimes they leave things."
Food.
"Supplies." "Out of pity?" he asked, turning back to her. His eyes were piercing. "Out of kindness," Beatrice corrected. "And perhaps because they, too, remember my father. Remember the man he was before the lies." Roderick stood, the piece of wood still in his hand. He looked at it, then at her, a strange expression on his face. He seemed to be struggling with something, some internal conflict that she couldn't quite fathom. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of a rushing stream. He crushed the bit of charred wood within his grip, the small pieces flaking into dust at his feet. He took a deep breath, as though deciding. When he turned back to her, his face had returned to a cold mask, but she thought she saw a trace of something else there too. A hesitation. "I will return at sunset," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "Be prepared." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the forest, leaving Beatrice alone with her fear, her hope, and the unsettling weight of his unspoken promise. She watched until he was gone, her mind racing, her heart pounding. What did he mean? What would happen at sunset? Would he return to arrest her, to drag her back to the king? Or was there something else, something more complex at play? She didn't know. And the uncertainty was almost as terrifying as the certainty of death. Chapter 3. The King's Decree. The hours that followed were a torment of waiting. Beatrice tried to busy herself with the mundane tasks of survival, gathering more firewood, checking her snares for rabbits, mending a tear in her worn cloak, but her mind remained fixed on Roderick's parting words. Be prepared. The ambiguity of the phrase gnawed at her, a constant reminder of her precarious situation. She found herself pacing the small clearing, her steps restless and agitated. The forest, which had always been her sanctuary, now felt like a cage, its towering trees and dense undergrowth closing in on her. The silence, once a comfort, now seemed oppressive, filled with unspoken threats and unseen dangers. She tried to pray, kneeling beside the small, makeshift altar she had created from a flat stone and a handful of wildflowers. But the words felt hollow, empty. Her faith, once a source of strength and solace, had been shaken by the events of the past 5 years. How could she pray to a God who had allowed her father to be unjustly accused and executed? How could she trust in a divine power that had seemingly abandoned her to her fate? As the sun began its slow descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the forest floor, Beatrice found herself drawn to the edge of the clearing, her gaze fixed on the path where Roderick had disappeared. She strained her ears, listening for any sign of his approach, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She remembered the king's decree, read aloud in the market square of Westmere, her father standing in chains, his face pale but resolute. The words echoed in her memory, chilling and merciless. By order of His Royal Majesty, King Edmund, Lord Alaric of Westmere is hereby declared a traitor to the crown. He is found guilty of conspiring with the enemies of the realm, of plotting to overthrow the rightful king and seize the throne for himself. For these heinous crimes, he is sentenced to death by beheading. His lands and titles are forfeit to the crown. His family is banished, stripped of their rights and privileges, forever branded with the stain of treason. The decree had been followed by a roar of approval from the crowd, a chorus of voices fueled by fear and propaganda. Beatrice, hidden in the shadows, had watched in horror as her father was led away, his head held high, his eyes meeting hers for one last, heartbreaking moment. She had seen the flash of the executioner's axe, heard the sickening thud, and then nothing. The memory brought a fresh wave of grief, a sharp, agonizing pain that threatened to consume her. She closed her eyes, clutching her arms around herself, as if to ward off the cold that seeped into her bones. She thought of her mother, Lady Eleanor, who had died of a broken heart just months after her husband's execution. She thought of her younger brother, Thomas, who had been sent away to a distant monastery, his fate unknown. She was alone, the last of the Westmeres, a living ghost haunted by the past. And now, the king's executioner had found her. The man who had carried out her father's sentence, the man who represented everything she had lost, was coming back. A sudden sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves brought her back to the present. She whirled around, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, rusty dagger she kept hidden in her boot. Roderick emerged from the shadows, his figure tall and imposing in the fading light. He was not alone. 2 other men, clad in the king's livery, stood behind him, their faces grim and unyielding. They carried swords and shields, their presence a clear indication of their purpose. Beatrice's heart sank.
This was it, then. The end.
She had hoped, against all reason, that Roderick might have had a change of heart, that he might have decided to spare her. But the presence of his men shattered that fragile hope. Roderick stopped a few feet away from her, his gaze meeting hers. His expression was difficult to read in the dim light, but she thought she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret? Resignation? Or simply the cold, hard determination of a man carrying out his duty? Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice formal and devoid of emotion. I have returned, as I promised. Beatrice straightened her shoulders, lifting her chin. She would not beg. She would not plead. She would face her fate with whatever dignity she had left. I am ready, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Roderick nodded slowly. He gestured to his men.
Take her, he said.
The 2 men stepped forward, their hands reaching for her. Beatrice flinched, But she did not resist. She knew it was futile. She was outnumbered, outmatched. As they seized her arms, binding her wrists with rough rope, Roderick spoke again, his voice low and directed solely at her. "The king has been informed of your survival," he said. "He has issued a new decree." Beatrice's heart leaped with a flicker of desperate hope. A new decree? Could it be? Could he have pardoned her? Roderick held up a rolled parchment, sealed with the king's royal crest. He broke the seal and began to read, his voice echoing in the stillness of the gathering dusk. "By order of His Royal Majesty, King Edmund, it has come to our attention that Beatrice of Westmere, daughter of the traitor Alaric, is still alive. Despite previous reports of her demise, she has been found to be living in hiding, evading the king's justice. This is a grave offense, a defiance of the royal will. Therefore, we hereby decree that Beatrice of Westmere be brought before us, to answer for her crimes and to face the consequences of her father's treason." Beatrice's hope died, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. She was not to be pardoned. She was to be brought before the king, to face the same fate that had befallen her father. Roderick finished reading the decree and rolled the parchment back up. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a strange, unsettling mixture of emotions. He had brought her hope of mercy, then said hope with those official words. "You will be taken to Westmere Castle," he said. "There, you will await the king's arrival." Westmere, her ancestral home, the place where she had spent her childhood, the place where her life had been shattered. She was to be imprisoned in the very castle that had once been her sanctuary. The irony was almost unbearable. As the men began to lead her away, Beatrice turned to Roderick, her voice filled with a quiet desperation.
"Why?" she asked.
"Why did you not simply kill me? Why go through all this charade?" Roderick met her gaze, his expression unreadable. He did not answer her question. Instead, he said, "The king wishes to make an example of you, my lady. He wishes to show the realm that no one, not even the daughter of a traitor, can escape his justice." The king's word was delivered, but Beatrice did not miss the slightest pause, the softest breath, before he had referred to her as my lady. Chapter 4. A Hidden Sanctuary. The journey to Westmere was a blur of fear and exhaustion. Beatrice, bound and guarded, was forced to walk for miles through the dense forest, her bare feet bruised and bleeding. The two guards, silent and unyielding, showed her no mercy, pushing her onward whenever she stumbled or faltered. Roderick rode ahead, his figure a dark silhouette against the fading light, his presence a constant reminder of her impending doom. She tried to focus on the familiar landmarks, the towering trees, the rushing streams, the distant hills that marked the boundaries of her former life. But everything seemed different, distorted by the lens of fear and despair. The forest, once a place of refuge, now felt menacing, its shadows filled with unseen dangers. As darkness fell, they reached the outskirts of the Westmere lands. Beatrice could see the faint glow of torches in the distance, marking the location of the castle, her ancestral home. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her: longing, grief, fear, and a strange, unsettling sense of homecoming. They passed through the deserted village, the small cottages dark and silent. The villagers, who had once greeted her with smiles and curtsies, now remained hidden behind closed doors, afraid to show any sign of recognition or sympathy. Beatrice understood their fear. To be associated with the daughter of a traitor was to risk incurring the king's wrath. As they approached the castle gates, Beatrice's heart pounded in her chest. She could see the imposing stone walls, the towering battlements, the flickering torches that illuminated the entrance. The castle, once a symbol of her family's power and prestige, now loomed before her like a prison, a place of confinement and despair. The guards at the gate, recognizing Roderick and his men, opened the heavy wooden doors without question. Beatrice was led across the drawbridge, her footsteps echoing on the stone surface, and into the castle courtyard. The courtyard was a scene of bustling activity. Soldiers, servants, and courtiers moved about, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight. They stopped and stared as Beatrice was led past, their eyes filled with curiosity and suspicion. She could hear the whispers, the murmurs of Trader's daughter, Westmere, and the king's justice. She was taken to a small, sparsely furnished chamber in one of the castle towers. The room was cold and damp, its stone walls bare except for a single, narrow window that offered a glimpse of the moonlit sky. There was a straw pallet on the floor, a rough wooden stool, and a small, cracked pitcher of water. This was to be her prison cell. The guards left, locking the heavy wooden door behind them. Beatrice stood alone in the darkness, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear. She sank onto the straw pallet, her hands clutching her arms, as if to ward off the chill that seeped into her bones. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds of the castle, the distant voices, the clanging of metal, the muffled footsteps. She tried to imagine herself back in her hidden sanctuary in the forest, surrounded by the scent of herbs and the sounds of nature. But the image was fleeting, fragile, easily shattered by the reality of her confinement. She was trapped in the very place that had once been her home, surrounded by enemies, awaiting the arrival of the king. She had no hope of escape, no chance of reprieve. Her fate was sealed, or so she thought. As the hours passed, Beatrice drifted in and out of a restless sleep, her dreams filled with images of her father, her mother, her brother, and the terrifying events that had led to her downfall. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. She sat up, listening intently. The castle was quiet, the sounds of activity having subsided. It was the dead of night, the darkest hour before dawn. And then she heard it. A faint sound, barely audible, coming from the other side of the door. A soft tapping, a rhythmic pattern that seemed strangely familiar. She held her breath, straining her ears. The tapping continued, persistent and insistent. It was a code, a secret signal that she had learned as a child, a way of communicating with her brother, Thomas, when they were playing hide and seek in the castle corridors. Could it be? Could Thomas be here in Westmere? It seemed impossible. He had been sent away to a distant monastery, his fate unknown. And yet, the tapping continued, undeniable and unmistakable. Beatrice rose from the pallet, her heart filled with a surge of desperate hope. She crept to the door, her fingers tracing the cold, rough surface of the wood. She hesitated for a moment, her fear warring with her hope. What if it was a trick? What if it was one of the guards, trying to lure her into a trap? But the tapping continued, insistent and unwavering.
She had to take the chance. She had to know.
She responded to the tapping, replicating the code, her fingers trembling. The tapping stopped. A moment of silence, then a soft voice, barely a whisper, from the other side of the door. "Beatrice? Is that you?" It was Thomas, her brother, alive and here in Westmere. Tears welled up in Beatrice's eyes, tears of relief, of joy, of disbelief. She had not been abandoned. She was not alone. "Thomas," she whispered back, her voice choked with emotion. "It's me. It's really me."
"I'm here to help you," he said. "I found a secret passage."
"But we must be quick." And silent. A hidden sanctuary, within the very walls that held her captive. Hope, fragile but tenacious, bloomed in Beatrice's chest, a tiny flower pushing its way through the cracks in the stone. She did not know how Thomas had come to be here, or how he had discovered the secret passage, but she did not question it. She trusted him, implicitly, as she always had. He whispered instructions through a crack beneath the doorframe, a loose stone, a hidden lever, a dark corridor. It was risky, insane, but it was her only chance. And it seemed she was not entirely alone. Chapter 5. The Price of Silence. Following Thomas's whispered instructions, Beatrice felt along the cold, damp wall of her chamber. Her fingers, numb with cold and anxiety, traced the rough surface of the stones, searching for the telltale sign, a slight looseness, a subtle difference in texture. The silence of the castle was oppressive, broken only by the occasional creak of timbers and the distant hooting of an owl. Each sound made her jump, her nerves stretched taut as a bowstring. Finally, her fingers brushed against a stone that felt slightly different. It was slightly recessed, almost imperceptible, but definitely there. She pressed against it, gently at first, then with more force. The stone shifted, scraping against the surrounding mortar. A small cloud of dust puffed out, filling the air with the scent of ancient stone and damp earth. With a final push, the stone dislodged, revealing a dark, narrow opening behind it. Beatrice peered into the darkness, her heart pounding. It was a tight squeeze, barely wide enough for her to pass through, but it was a way out. A way to escape her prison cell. She listened again for any sound of approaching guards. Hearing nothing, she slipped through the opening, pulling the stone back into place behind her as best she could. She found herself in a narrow, pitch-black passage, the air thick with the smell of mildew and dust. She felt along the walls, her hands guiding her forward, her steps slow and cautious. As Thomas had instructed, she counted her steps, her mind focused on the task at hand, trying to block out the fear that gnawed at her. 20 steps, then a turn to the left. 10 more steps, then a downward slope. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, leading her deeper and deeper into the bowels of the castle. She could hear the faint sound of dripping water, the scurrying of rats, the occasional creak of unseen timbers. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on her, making it difficult to breathe. She stumbled several times, scraping her hands and knees on the rough stone floor, but she pressed on, driven by a desperate hope of escape. Finally, she reached the end of the passage. She felt a wooden panel, rough and splintered, blocking her way. As Thomas had described, she searched for the hidden lever, her fingers running along the edges of the panel. She found it, a small, metal latch, almost invisible in the darkness. She pressed it, and the panel swung inward, revealing another dark space beyond. She stepped through the opening and found herself in a small, circular chamber. A faint glimmer of light filtered in from a narrow slit in the wall, high above her head, illuminating the dusty space. And there, standing in the center of the chamber, was Thomas. He was taller than she remembered, his face leaner, his eyes filled with a maturity that belied his young age. He wore the simple brown robes of a novice monk, his head shaved in the traditional tonsure. But it was him, undeniably her brother. They rushed towards each other, embracing in a silent, tearful reunion. It had been 5 years since they had last seen each other, 5 years of separation and uncertainty. "Beatrice," Thomas whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "I thought I had lost you." "And I you," she replied, her voice trembling. How did you get here?" Thomas released her, his face grave. "I was sent to St. Michael's Abbey, as you know. But I never forgot you, Beatrice. I never forgot our father. I always believed in his innocence." He explained how he had overheard whispers among the monks, rumors of a conspiracy, of a plot to frame their father. He had spent years secretly researching, poring over ancient texts, searching for any clue, any evidence that might clear their father's name. "I discovered that one of the monks, Brother Anselm, had once served as a scribe in our father's court," Thomas said.
He knew something.
"He was afraid to speak, but I persuaded him." Beatrice listened, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. "What did he tell you?" "He told me that our father had discovered a plot against the king," Thomas said. "A plot orchestrated by Lord Mortine, one of the king's closest advisors. Our father had gathered evidence, intending to expose Mortine. But Mortine found out, and he moved quickly, framing our father for treason before he could reveal the truth." Lord Mortine. The name was familiar, a viper in the king's court, a man known for his ambition and ruthlessness. Beatrice had always suspected that he was involved in her father's downfall, but she had never had any proof. "Brother Anselm, he had a document," Thomas continued. "A letter, written by our father, detailing Morton's plot. He hid it, years ago, fearing for his life. He told me where to find it here in Westmere." The price of silence, Beatrice realized, was the lives of her family and a dangerous secret that threatened the king and kingdom. He had risked everything to come here. But how did you get inside the castle? Beatrice asked. Thomas smiled faintly. The monks of St. Michael's have certain connections. They helped me to get here, to infiltrate the castle. They believe in justice, Beatrice. They believe in clearing our father's name. And the secret passages? He nodded at the wall. The castle is riddled with them. Built long ago, for emergencies. But the king, Roderick, they're searching for me. I know. That is why we must hurry. The document is hidden somewhere in this chamber, Brother Anselm said. We must find it, and then escape before they discover we are gone. The chamber was small, barely large enough for the two of them. They began to search, their fingers running along the cold stone walls, tapping on the floor, examining every nook and cranny. The faint light from the slit in the wall provided little illumination, making their task even more difficult. Time was running out. They could hear the sounds of the castle awakening, the footsteps of guards, the voices of servants. They had to find the document and escape before it was too late. The price of silence was about to be paid, one way or another. And Beatrice feared it might be with their lives. Chapter 6. Scars of the Past. The search was frantic, desperate. Beatrice and Thomas worked in silence, their movements swift and efficient, their hands brushing against the cold, damp stone. The air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew, making it difficult to breathe. The faint light from the slit in the wall cast long, distorted shadows, making the small chamber seem even more claustrophobic. Beatrice felt a surge of frustration, of helplessness. They had been searching for what seemed like hours, but they had found nothing. The document, the key to clearing their father's name and exposing Morton's treachery, remained elusive. It has to be here, Thomas muttered, his voice strained. Brother Anselm was certain. He said it was hidden in a place where the falcon rests. The falcon, Beatrice repeated, her mind racing. The falcon was the sigil of House Westmere, their family crest. It was depicted on tapestries, carvings, and armor throughout the castle. But where, in this small, empty chamber, could a falcon be resting? She looked around, her gaze sweeping across the walls, the floor, the ceiling. And then she saw it. High above their heads, near the narrow slit that provided the only source of light, a small, almost imperceptible carving of a falcon, its wings outstretched, as if in flight. Thomas, look, she exclaimed, pointing to the carving. Thomas followed her gaze, his eyes widening. Of course, he whispered. The falcon rests near the light. He dragged the wooden stool, the only piece of furniture in the chamber, beneath the carving. He climbed onto it, stretching his arm towards the falcon. His fingers brushed against the stone, feeling for any sign of a hidden compartment, a loose stone, anything that might conceal the document. Suddenly, they heard a sound, the faint but unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching. Someone was coming. Beatrice's heart leaped into her throat. They were out of time. Hurry, Thomas, she urged, her voice a desperate whisper. Thomas pressed against the falcon carving, his fingers probing the surrounding stone. He felt something give, a slight movement, a subtle click. A small section of the wall, disguised as part of the carving, swung inward, revealing a narrow recess behind it. Inside the recess lay a small, rolled-up parchment tied with a faded ribbon. The document. Thomas grabbed the parchment, his hand trembling. He jumped down from the stool, just as the door to the chamber began to open. They were trapped. But then, a voice spoke from the shadows, a voice that Beatrice recognized, a voice that sent a shiver down her spine. Quickly, Roderick Locksley said, his voice low and urgent. This way. He stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against a faint light from the corridor.
He was not blocking their escape.
He was offering it. Beatrice and Thomas exchanged a stunned glance. Roderick? Helping them? It made no sense. He was the king's executioner, the man who had carried out her father's sentence, the man who had brought her here to face the king's justice. Why would he be helping them to escape? But there was no time to question his motives. They had to act quickly before the guards discovered them. Roderick gestured towards a narrow passage that branched off from the chamber, a passage that Beatrice had not noticed before. "This will lead you to the outer walls," he said. "There is a small postern gate unguarded. You can escape through there." Beatrice hesitated, her eyes searching his face.
"Why?"
she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" Roderick met her gaze, his expression unreadable. His eyes, usually cold and hard, seemed to flicker with a strange mixture of emotions: regret, sadness, and something else, something she couldn't quite identify. "I have my reasons," he said, his voice low and gruff.
"Go. Now.
Before it is too late." He stepped aside, allowing them to pass. Thomas, clutching the precious document, moved first, disappearing into the darkness of the passage. Beatrice followed, but she paused for a moment, looking back at Roderick. The scars of the past, both visible and hidden, were etched on his face, a map of battles fought, of losses endured, of burdens carried. She saw, for the first time, not just the king's executioner, but a man haunted by his own demons, a man struggling with his own conscience. The encounter in the clearing, his strange and probing questions, began to fit within a larger context. He was no longer the monolithic figure of dread. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with a sincerity that surprised even herself. Roderick nodded, a slight inclination of his head, his expression unchanging.
He did not speak.
He simply watched as she turned and followed her brother into the darkness, leaving him alone in the shadows, the weight of his secrets heavy on his shoulders. The passage was dark, narrow, and treacherous, but it led to freedom. And for the first time in a long time, Beatrice felt a glimmer of hope, a spark of defiance, rekindled within her heart. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that Roderick, the man who had just saved her life, was still an enigma, a mystery she had to unravel. And she knew, with a chilling certainty, that their paths would cross again. Chapter 7. The Unspoken Bond. The escape from Westmere was a harrowing ordeal. Beatrice and Thomas, guided by Roderick's brief instructions, navigated the labyrinthine passages beneath the castle, their hearts pounding with every creak of timbers, every distant shout. The air was thick with dust and the smell of decay, making it difficult to breathe. They stumbled several times, their hands and knees scraping against the rough stone floor, but they pressed on, driven by the desperate need to escape. Emerging from the postern gate, they found themselves outside the castle walls, shrouded in the pre-dawn darkness. The air was cold and crisp, a welcome change from the stifling atmosphere of the underground passages. They could hear the sounds of the castle awakening, the shouts of guards, the barking of dogs. They knew they had to get away quickly, before their escape was discovered. They ran, their lungs burning, their legs aching, towards the cover of the nearby forest. They did not speak, their focus entirely on putting as much distance as possible between themselves and Westmere. Once they reached the safety of the trees, they slowed their pace, collapsing against a thick oak, their bodies trembling with exhaustion and relief. They were safe for now, but they knew that their journey was far from over. "We have to get to St. Michael's," Thomas said, his voice breathless. "The monks there, they will help us. They can protect us." Beatrice nodded, her gaze fixed on the rolled-up parchment that Thomas clutched in his hand. The document. The key to clearing their father's name and exposing Morton's treachery. It was a dangerous burden, a prize that could cost them their lives. "Roderick," Beatrice said, her voice filled with a mixture of confusion and gratitude. "Why did he help us?" "He is the king's executioner." "It makes no sense." Thomas shook his head. "I do not know, but I trust him." There was something in his eyes, a sadness, a regret. "I believe he is not what he seems." Beatrice remembered the look on Roderick's face, the flicker of emotion in his eyes, the scars that spoke of a past filled with pain and loss. She, too, sensed that there was more to the man than met the eye. An unspoken bond, forged in the crucible of their shared tragedy, seemed to connect them, despite their seemingly opposing roles. They began their journey towards St. Michael's Abbey, traveling by day, hiding by night, avoiding the main roads and villages. They relied on the kindness of strangers, sharing their meager supplies, sleeping in barns and haylofts, always wary of being recognized. As they traveled, Beatrice found herself thinking about Roderick, replaying their brief encounters in her mind, trying to decipher the mystery of his actions. His question in the clearing, "Why do I wish to let you live?" echoed in her thoughts. It was a question that she, too, was now asking herself. One evening, as they sat beside a small campfire, sharing a crust of bread and a few dried berries, Beatrice decided to speak her mind. "Thomas," she said, "I believe Roderick is somehow connected to our father's death. Not in the way we think, but involved somehow." Thomas looked at her, his eyes thoughtful. "I have considered the same. His actions, they defy logic. Unless he knows more than he lets on." "Perhaps he was there," Beatrice said, her voice barely a whisper. "Perhaps he witnessed what happened. Perhaps he knows the truth. And perhaps," Thomas added, "he is looking for redemption." The idea hung in the air between them, a fragile possibility, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. Could the king's executioner, the man who had carried out their father's sentence, be their ally? It seemed improbable, impossible even. And yet, they could not deny the evidence of their own eyes, the reality of his unexpected assistance. "We have to find out," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "We have to uncover the truth, not just about Mortine, but about Roderick as well." Thomas nodded in agreement. Their quest for justice had taken an unexpected turn. They were no longer simply seeking to clear their father's name. They were also seeking to understand the enigmatic man who had saved their lives, the man who held the key to unlocking the secrets of the past. As they continued their journey, Beatrice felt a growing sense of unease, a premonition that their path would inevitably lead them back to Roderick. The unspoken bond between them, forged in the shadows of Westmere, was a thread that connected their fates, a thread that would either lead them to salvation or to destruction. She clutched a small, smooth stone she'd picked up outside the postern gate. A reminder of the castle, of escape, of him. She couldn't explain the impulse, but she held the stone tight, feeling its coolness against her palm. It was a tangible link to the man who was both her enemy and her unlikely savior. A bond existed, one she couldn't explain, but certainly felt. And that bond was about to be tested. Chapter 8. Shadows of Westmere. The journey to St. Michael's Abbey was arduous and fraught with peril. Beatrice and Thomas, disguised as pilgrims, traversed the rugged countryside, their senses constantly on alert. They avoided the main roads, sticking to less traveled paths, their footsteps muffled by the fallen leaves and damp earth. The landscape, once familiar and comforting to Beatrice, now seemed alien and threatening, each shadow concealing a potential danger. The weight of the document, hidden within Thomas's simple robes, pressed heavily on their minds. It was a tangible representation of their hope, their quest for justice, but also a constant source of anxiety. They knew that if it were discovered, their lives would be forfeit. They spoke little, their conversations limited to whispered exchanges, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The silence was broken only by the sounds of nature, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant howl of a wolf. As they neared the abbey, the landscape began to change. The dense forest gave way to rolling hills, dotted with small farms and vineyards. The air was filled with the scent of wood smoke and freshly tilled earth. They could see the towering spires of the abbey in the distance, a beacon of hope in the vast expanse of the countryside. But even as they approached their sanctuary, Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over her. The shadows of Westmere, the memory of Roderick's unexpected intervention, continued to haunt her. She found herself constantly looking over her shoulder, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, smooth stone she carried, the tangible link to the enigmatic executioner. One evening, as they camped beneath a stand of ancient oaks, Beatrice decided to share her growing concerns with Thomas. "I cannot shake the feeling that we are being watched," she said, her voice low and troubled. "That someone knows of our escape of the document. Thomas nodded, his face grim. I feel it too, Beatrice. We must be even more cautious. Morton's reach is long. He will not hesitate to silence us if he discovers we have proof of his treachery. And Roderick, Beatrice added, her voice barely a whisper. What if he was sent to follow us? What if his help was merely a ruse, a way to lure us into a trap? Thomas considered her words, his brow furrowed. It is possible, but I do not believe it. He could have killed us at Westmere easily.
He chose not to.
There is something else at play, Beatrice. Something we do not yet understand. They fell silent, their thoughts consumed by the uncertainties that lay ahead. The campfire crackled, casting flickering shadows on their faces, illuminating the fear and determination that mingled in their eyes. As they prepared to sleep, Beatrice took out the small, smooth stone, holding it tightly in her hand. She closed her eyes, remembering the moment she had picked it up, outside the postern gate of Westmere. She remembered the look on Roderick's face, the strange mixture of emotions in his eyes. She had a sudden, overwhelming urge to see him again, to confront him, to demand answers. She knew it was reckless, dangerous even, but she couldn't ignore the pull, the unspoken bond that connected them. Thomas, she said, her voice hesitant. I need to go back. Thomas looked at her, his eyes filled with alarm. Go back? To Westmere? Are you mad? It is too dangerous.
I know, Beatrice said.
But I have to.
I have to understand.
I have to know why Roderick helped us. He is the king's executioner, Beatrice, Thomas reminded her. He is not our friend.
Perhaps not, Beatrice said.
But he is not entirely our enemy either. There is something more to him, Thomas. I feel it, and I need to find out what it is. And the document?
Thomas asked. What about Mortine?
We are so close to St. Michael's. We can find sanctuary there, expose Morton's treachery.
You go on to the Abbey, Beatrice said.
Take the document.
Keep it safe.
I will go back to Westmere. I will find Roderick. And I will find the answers we need. Thomas argued, pleaded with her to reconsider. But Beatrice was resolute. She had made up her mind. She knew it was a perilous undertaking, a gamble that could cost her life. But she could not ignore the pull, the instinct that told her she had to return to Westmere, to confront the shadows of her past and the enigmatic man who held the key to her future. She knew it was a fool's errand, going back to a place of such heartache and danger. But something was drawing her. A need. A sense of unfinished business. A connection. And as the embers of the fire died down, Beatrice knew she had to face the shadows, no matter the cost. Chapter 9. The Serpent's Coil. Beatrice's decision to return to Westmere was met with Thomas's strong disapproval, but he eventually yielded to her unwavering determination. He understood her need for answers, her sense of unfinished business with Roderick, even if he couldn't fully comprehend it. They agreed on a plan. Thomas would continue to St. Michael's Abbey with the document, seeking sanctuary and support, while Beatrice would return to Westmere, cautiously and under disguise. They parted ways at dawn, a somber farewell, filled with unspoken anxieties. Thomas gave her a small, worn leather pouch containing a few coins and a simple pilgrim's cross, tokens of protection and disguise. He embraced her tightly, his voice choked with emotion. Be careful, Beatrice, he whispered. Mortine is a dangerous enemy, and Roderick, I still do not trust him completely. I will be careful, Beatrice promised, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. I will find the answers we need, and I will return to you. With a final, lingering look, they separated, each heading in a different direction, their fates intertwined yet uncertain. Beatrice watched as Thomas disappeared into the morning mist, his figure gradually fading from view. She felt a pang of loneliness, of fear, but she pushed it aside, steeling herself for the perilous journey ahead. She traveled alone, disguised as a humble pilgrim, her face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat and a coarse woolen cloak. She avoided the main roads, sticking to the less traveled paths, her senses constantly on alert. She slept in haylofts and under the open sky, her meals consisting of whatever she could forage or beg from kindly villagers. The closer she got to Westmere, the more her anxiety grew. The familiar landscape, once a source of comfort, now seemed menacing, each shadow concealing a potential threat. She replayed her escape from the castle in her mind, recalling every detail, every word exchanged with Roderick. She tried to make sense of his actions, his motives, but she found no easy answers. She arrived at the outskirts of Westmere under the cover of darkness. The castle loomed before her, its towering walls and battlements silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The sight of it sent a shiver down her spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling sense of homecoming. She knew she couldn't simply walk through the castle gates. She had to find another way in, a way that would allow her to move unnoticed, to observe and gather information without revealing her presence. She remembered the postern gate, the secret passage that Roderick had shown them. It was a risky option, but it was her only chance. She circled the castle walls, her eyes searching for the small, almost invisible opening. She found it, hidden beneath a thick growth of ivy, just as she remembered. She slipped through the gate, her heart pounding, and found herself once again in the dark, narrow passage. She navigated the labyrinthine corridors, her footsteps echoing softly on the stone floor. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and dust, making it difficult to breathe. She could hear the faint sounds of the castle, the distant voices of guards, the clanging of metal. She reached the small, circular chamber where she had reunited with Thomas, the place where Roderick had unexpectedly intervened. She paused, her hand resting on the cold stone wall, remembering the moment of their encounter, the strange mixture of emotions in Roderick's eyes. She knew he frequented the castle's chapel. It was a place of solitude, of reflection, a place where even the king's executioner might seek solace. It was there, she decided, that she would confront him. She found the chapel, its entrance marked by a heavy wooden door, intricately carved with scenes of biblical figures. She pushed the door open, slowly and cautiously, and stepped inside. The chapel was dimly lit by a few flickering candles, their flames casting long, dancing shadows on the stone walls. The air was filled with the scent of incense and beeswax. The stained glass windows, depicting scenes of saints and martyrs, glowed with a soft, ethereal light. And there, kneeling before the altar, his head bowed in prayer, was Roderick. Beatrice hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come this far, risked everything to confront him, but now, standing in his presence, she felt a surge of doubt, of fear. But she couldn't turn back. She had to know the truth. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and stepped forward, her footsteps echoing softly in the stillness of the chapel. Roderick did not seem to notice her presence. He remained kneeling, his body motionless, his head bowed. "Sir Roderick," Beatrice said, her voice a low whisper. He started, turning his head sharply, his eyes widening in surprise. He rose to his feet, his expression a mixture of shock and something else. Was it apprehension? Or perhaps relief? "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice low and guarded. "What are you doing here? It is dangerous." "I had to come back," Beatrice said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I had to know why you helped us." Roderick met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. The silence stretched between them, heavy and laden with unspoken questions, with the weight of their shared past, with the serpent's coil of secrets and lies that bound them together. He looked as though he was about to speak, to finally explain. But then a noise from the corridor. Footsteps. Approaching. He stiffened, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his sword. "Someone is coming," he said, his voice urgent. "Hide. Quickly." The moment of revelation was lost, snatched away by the ever-present danger that surrounded them. And Beatrice knew that the serpent's coil was tightening, drawing them both deeper into its deadly embrace. Chapter 10. A Knight's Burden. Roderick's warning sent a jolt of adrenaline through Beatrice. She quickly scanned the chapel, her eyes searching for a place to conceal herself. The approaching footsteps grew louder, closer. There was no time to think, to plan. Instinct took over. She darted behind a large, ornately carved confessional, pressing herself against the cold stone wall, her heart pounding in her chest. She held her breath, listening intently, her body tense and ready to flee. The chapel door creaked open, and a figure entered. Beatrice, peering through a narrow gap in the confessional's latticework, could see the newcomer's silhouette against the flickering candlelight. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, clad in the rich attire of a nobleman.
Lord Mortine.
Beatrice's blood ran cold. Mortine, the very man whose treachery they were trying to expose, was here in the chapel with Roderick. What was he doing here? Was this a prearranged meeting? Or a chance encounter? She strained to hear their conversation, her ears straining to catch every word, every nuance. Sir Roderick, Mortine said, his voice smooth and oily, yet edged with steel. I trust you have news for me. Regarding the fugitive. Roderick remained silent for a moment, his back to Mortine, his posture rigid. Beatrice could sense the tension in his body, the unspoken conflict that raged within him. I have searched, Roderick finally said, his voice carefully neutral. But I have found no trace of the traitor's daughter. Mortine chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound.
Come now, Sir Roderick. Do not play games with me.
You are the king's executioner, the most skilled tracker in the realm. Are you telling me you cannot find a mere slip of a girl? She is resourceful, Roderick said, his voice still devoid of emotion. And she has help. There are those who still believe in her father's innocence, those who would shelter her. Then find them, Mortine snapped, his voice hardening. And bring them to me, along with the girl. I want them all silenced. Permanently. Beatrice felt a surge of anger, of outrage, at Morton's callous disregard for human life. He was a monster, a man consumed by ambition and power, willing to do anything to protect his secrets. Roderick turned slightly, facing Mortine, his expression still unreadable. My lord, he said, his voice measured, I am the king's executioner, not his assassin. I carry out the king's justice. I do not hunt down innocent people. Morton's eyes narrowed, his face darkening with anger. Innocent? He sneered. The girl is a traitor's daughter, a threat to the king, to the realm. She must be eliminated. She is also, Roderick said, his voice taking on a subtle edge, a woman. Unarmed. Defenseless. She is a symbol, Mortine retorted, his voice rising. A symbol of rebellion, of defiance. She must be made an example of. To remind everyone what happens to those who oppose the king. The king, Roderick said, his voice low and dangerous, is a just man. He would not condone the murder of an innocent woman. Mortine stepped closer to Roderick, his face contorted with rage. The king, he hissed, will do as I tell him. He is weak, easily manipulated. I control him, Sir Roderick. And I control you. The words hung in the air, heavy and laden with threat. Beatrice held her breath, her heart pounding. The confrontation between the two men was escalating, reaching a dangerous climax. Roderick stood his ground, his gaze unwavering, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. I serve the king, he said, his voice firm.
Not you, Mortine.
Mortine laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You serve whoever holds the power, Sir Roderick. And right now that is me. Remember your oath. Remember your duty. Remember your past. The last words were spoken with a particular emphasis, a veiled threat that sent a chill down Beatrice's spine. What past was Mortine referring to? What secrets did Roderick hold? Roderick flinched, almost imperceptibly, but Beatrice saw it. The mention of his past had struck a nerve, a raw wound that Mortine was deliberately prodding. A knight's burden, Beatrice realized, was not just the weight of his armor or the sharpness of his sword, but the ghosts of his past, the choices he had made, the oaths he had sworn. The silence stretched between the two men, taut and unbearable. Then Mortine spoke again, his voice softer now, more insidious. Find the girl, Sir Roderick, he said. Bring her to me, and all will be forgiven. Your past will remain buried. Your loyalty will be rewarded. He turned and walked towards the door, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the chapel. He paused at the threshold, looking back at Roderick. "Do not fail me, Sir Roderick," he said, "or you will face the consequences. Both you and the girl." He left, the door closing behind him with a resounding thud. Roderick remained standing, his body rigid, his gaze fixed on the closed door. He was alone, once again, with his burden, with his secrets, with the impossible choice that Mortine had forced upon him. Beatrice watched him, her heart aching for him, for the torment she saw etched on his face. She knew, without a doubt, that he was not Morton's ally. He was a man trapped, caught between his duty and his conscience, between his past and his future. And she, it seemed, was the key to his redemption or his destruction. Chapter 11. The Falcon's Flight. The silence in the chapel after Morton's departure was thick and heavy, laden with unspoken tension. Roderick remained motionless, his back to the confessional, his shoulders slumped as if bearing an unbearable weight. Beatrice, her heart pounding, waited, unsure of what to do, what to say. Finally, Roderick turned, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger, frustration, and despair. He saw her, standing in the shadows near the confessional, her presence a silent accusation. "You heard," he said, his voice hoarse. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. Beatrice nodded, her gaze meeting his unflinchingly. "I heard," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. He walked towards her, his steps slow and deliberate, stopping just a few feet away. The candlelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on his face, highlighting the lines of strain and weariness. "You should not have come back," he said, his voice low and filled with regret. "It is too dangerous." "I had to," Beatrice said. "I had to understand. Why you helped us. Why you risked your life for me and my brother." Roderick looked away, his gaze fixed on the stained glass windows, their colors muted in the dim light. "I had my reasons," he said, his voice evasive. "Reasons that have to do with your past," Beatrice said, her voice gentle but persistent. "Reasons that Mortine knows about, that he is using against you." Roderick flinched, as if her words had struck a physical blow. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "My past is complicated," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It is filled with mistakes, with regrets, with things I cannot change." "Tell me," Beatrice urged. "Tell me what happened. Let me help you." He hesitated, his internal struggle evident in his every gesture, in the lines etched on his face. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decide whether he could trust her, whether he could share the burden he had carried for so long. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and filled with a raw emotion that made Beatrice's heart ache. "Years ago," he began, "before I became the king's executioner, I served another lord. Lord Valerius. A good man, a just man. But he had enemies. Powerful enemies." He paused, taking a deep breath, as if the memories were too painful to bear. "Mortine," he continued, his voice hardening with anger, "was one of those enemies. He coveted Valerius's lands, his titles, his influence. He plotted against him, weaving a web of lies and deceit, just as he did with your father." Beatrice listened, her heart pounding with a growing sense of dread, of recognition. She saw the parallels, the similarities between her father's fate and that of Lord Valerius. Morton's treachery was a recurring pattern, a serpent's coil that ensnared innocent victims. "I was young then," Roderick said, his voice filled with self-reproach. "Naive. Loyal to a fault. I believed in my lord's innocence. I defended him. I fought for him. But Mortine, he was too powerful. He had the king's ear. He controlled the court. He framed Valerius, just as he framed your father. Accused him of treason, of plotting against the crown." "And Valerius?" Beatrice asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roderick closed his eyes, his face contorted with pain. "He was executed," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "By my own hand." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She had suspected, she had feared, but hearing the words, spoken aloud, was a shock, a blow to her heart. I was ordered to carry out the sentence, Roderick continued, his voice trembling. By the king. I had no choice. I was a knight, sworn to obey my king, to uphold the law, even if it meant killing an innocent man. But you knew he was innocent, Beatrice said, her voice filled with a mixture of anger and compassion. I suspected, Roderick said, but I had no proof. And I was afraid. Afraid of Mortine, afraid of the king, afraid of what would happen to me if I disobeyed. He had chosen duty, as he perceived it, overdoing what he thought was right. After Valerius's death, he continued, Mortine rewarded me. He gave me lands, titles, influence. He made me the king's executioner. He wanted me close, under his control. A reminder of my complicity. And you have lived with that guilt, Beatrice said, her voice soft, understanding. For all these years. Roderick nodded, his eyes filled with tears. It is a burden I will carry to my grave, he said. The blood of an innocent man on my hands. Beatrice reached out, her hand touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of forgiveness. You were young, she said. You were manipulated just as my father was. You were a victim, too. Roderick looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude that was almost unbearable. Thank you, he whispered. For understanding. For not judging me. We are both victims of Morton's treachery, Beatrice said. We are both seeking justice, redemption. We can help each other. Roderick nodded, a glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. The document, he said. Your brother, he has it? Yes, Beatrice said. He is taking it to St. Michael's Abbey. They will help us expose Mortine. We must get to him, Roderick said. Before Mortine finds him. Before it is too late. The falcon, the symbol of House Westmere, had been grounded, its wings clipped by treachery and deceit. But now, it was time for the falcon to fly again, to soar above the shadows, to seek justice, to reclaim its rightful place. And Beatrice and Roderick, unlikely allies bound by a shared past and a common purpose, would fly together. Beatrice, taking one last look around the chapel, felt the weight of the moment. They were taking flight against a powerful foe, and their wings were untested. But they would fly nonetheless. Chapter 12. Echoes in the chapel. The urgency of their situation pressed upon them. Roderick, shedding the heavy cloak of the king's executioner, both literally and figuratively, moved with a newfound purpose. He knew the dangers that lay ahead, the ruthlessness of Mortine, and the precariousness of their position. We must leave immediately, Roderick said, his voice low and urgent. Mortine will not waste any time. He will send his men after Thomas, after the document. Beatrice nodded, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. How do we get out of the castle? The gates will be guarded. Roderick led her through a series of hidden passages, known only to a select few, remnants of a time when the castle was a fortress against invaders. The corridors were narrow, dark, and damp, the air thick with the smell of ancient stone and dust. They moved swiftly and silently, their footsteps echoing softly in the stillness. As they navigated the labyrinthine passages, Beatrice couldn't help but reflect on the transformation she had witnessed in Roderick. He was no longer the stoic, unyielding executioner, the figure of dread and authority. He was a man, vulnerable, flawed, but driven by a desire for redemption, for justice. The chapel, Beatrice said, breaking the silence. It holds memories for you, doesn't it? Roderick nodded, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. It was Valerius's favorite place, he said, his voice filled with a quiet sadness. He would spend hours there, praying, reflecting. He found solace in its solitude. And you? Beatrice asked. Do you find solace there? Roderick hesitated for a moment, then spoke, his voice barely a whisper. I used to. Before everything happened. Now it is a reminder of my failure, of my guilt. It can also be a place of healing, Beatrice said, her voice soft but firm. A place of forgiveness, of new beginnings. Roderick looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw not judgment, not condemnation, but understanding, compassion, and a shared hope for a better future. They reached a small, hidden door leading to the outside world. Roderick paused, his hand resting on the latch. "Once we leave," he said, "there is no turning back. We will be hunted, both by Mortine and by the king, if he discovers our defiance." "I know," Beatrice said, her voice unwavering, "but we have to try. We have to expose Mortine, clear our father's names, and bring justice to those who have been wronged." Roderick nodded, his resolve hardening. He opened the door, and they stepped out into the cool night air. They found themselves in a secluded courtyard, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, far from the main gates of the castle. Roderick secured 2 horses from a hidden stable, mounts used for discreet errands, not the grand war horses of the knights. They were swift and sure-footed, suitable for a long and difficult journey. As they mounted their horses, Beatrice looked back at the castle, its towering walls silhouetted against the moonlit sky. The echoes of the chapel, the whispers of the past, the weight of secrets and lies, seemed to linger in the air. But she turned her back on it, focusing on the road ahead, on the journey to St. Michael's, on the hope of justice and redemption. They rode through the night, their horses' hooves pounding on the soft earth, their bodies swaying with the rhythm of the ride. They spoke little, their thoughts consumed by the dangers that lay ahead and the uncertainties of their mission. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky with hues of pink and gold, they reached the edge of the forest, the vast expanse of trees stretching before them like a dark, forbidding ocean. Roderick paused, his gaze sweeping across the landscape. "We will be safer in the forest," he said, "less likely to be seen. But it is also more difficult terrain. We must be careful." Beatrice nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the small, smooth stone she carried, the reminder of her escape from Westmere, the tangible link to the man who was now her companion, her protector, her fellow seeker of justice. They entered the forest, the trees closing in around them, their branches forming a dense canopy overhead. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, creating a dappled pattern of light and shadow on the forest floor. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of pine and earth. As they rode deeper into the forest, Beatrice felt a sense of peace, of connection to the natural world, a feeling she had not experienced since her days of hiding in the wilderness. The forest was a sanctuary, a place of refuge, but it was also a place of secrets, of hidden dangers. She knew that their journey would be long and arduous, that they would face many obstacles, many challenges. But she was not afraid. She had Roderick by her side, a man who had shed his mask of authority and revealed his true self, a man who was willing to risk everything to right the wrongs of the past. And as they rode, she allowed a quiet moment to consider all they'd left behind, the weight of it, and all they were riding toward, the uncertainty. The echoes in the chapel were still with her, but they were fading, replaced by the sounds of the forest, the rhythm of their horses' hooves, and the steady beat of her own heart, filled with a fragile hope for the future. Chapter 13. The Torn Tapestry. The forest was a world of its own, a realm of ancient trees, hidden paths, and whispered secrets. Beatrice and Roderick rode in silence, their senses alert to every sound, every movement. The sunlight, filtered through the dense canopy, cast an ethereal glow on the forest floor, illuminating patches of wildflowers, moss-covered rocks, and the intricate network of roots that snaked beneath the surface. They followed a narrow, winding trail, barely discernible beneath the fallen leaves. Roderick, familiar with the terrain, led the way, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his hand never far from the hilt of his sword. Beatrice, her senses heightened by the years she had spent living in the wilderness, followed close behind, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. As they rode, Beatrice found herself reflecting on the events of the past few days. Her life had been turned upside down, her world shattered and rebuilt in a matter of hours. She had gone from being a hunted fugitive, a ghost living in the shadows, to a woman on a mission, a woman seeking justice, a woman fighting for her future. And Roderick, The man who had once represented everything she feared had become her unlikely ally, her protector, her companion in this perilous quest. She had seen his vulnerability, his pain, his remorse, and she had come to trust him, to believe in his inherent goodness, despite his past actions. She stole glances at him as they rode, observing the lines of strain on his face, the way he gripped the reins, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. She wanted to reach out to him, to offer him comfort, to reassure him that they were in this together, that they would face whatever came their way, together. But she held back, unsure of how he would react, unsure of the boundaries of their newfound relationship. They were bound together by a shared purpose, by a common enemy, but they were also strangers, their lives intertwined by circumstance, by fate. As the day wore on, they stopped to rest and water their horses by a clear, fast-flowing stream. They ate a simple meal of bread and cheese, sharing their meager supplies, their conversation limited to whispered exchanges about their journey, their plans, their concerns. "We should reach the outskirts of the Abbey lands by nightfall," Roderick said, his voice low and thoughtful. "But we must be cautious. Morton's men could be anywhere." Beatrice nodded, her gaze fixed on the stream, her thoughts drifting back to Westmere, to the chapel, to the conversation she had overheard between Roderick and Mortine. "Mortine spoke of your past," she said, her voice hesitant. "Of your loyalty. What did he mean?" Roderick looked away, his expression troubled. "He was referring to Valerius's death," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "To my role in it." "He made it sound like you had a choice," Beatrice said. "Like you could have saved him." Roderick sighed, his shoulders slumping. "I could have," he said, his voice filled with self-reproach. "I could have spoken out. I could have defied the king. I could have risked everything to save him." "But you didn't," Beatrice said, her voice gentle but firm. "I didn't," Roderick confirmed, his voice heavy with guilt. "I was afraid. I was weak. I chose to obey, to survive, rather than to do what was right." "And you have lived with that guilt," Beatrice said, "ever since." Roderick nodded, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. "It is a burden I will carry to my grave," he said. Beatrice reached out, her hand touching his arm, a gesture of comfort, of understanding. "We all make mistakes, Roderick," she said. "We all have regrets. But it is what we do after that matters. It is how we choose to live our lives, how we choose to atone for our past sins." Roderick looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw not judgment, not condemnation, but compassion, empathy, and a shared hope for redemption. He saw a strength he didn't know he possessed, reflected in her eyes. "Thank you, Beatrice," he said, his voice sincere, "for seeing the good in me, for believing in me, even when I did not believe in myself." They sat in silence for a few moments, the only sound the gentle murmur of the stream, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The torn tapestry of their lives, once frayed and tattered, was slowly being mended, thread by thread, by their shared experiences, their shared purpose, their shared hope. But the tapestry was far from complete. There were still missing pieces, still unanswered questions, still dangers that lay ahead. And as they prepared to continue their journey, Beatrice knew that the road to St. Michael's, the road to justice, the road to redemption, would be long and arduous, filled with trials and tribulations that would test their courage, their loyalty, and their newfound bond. As they prepared to mount, Beatrice noticed a small, intricately woven piece of fabric snagged on a low-hanging branch. It was a fragment of a tapestry, depicting a falcon in flight, its wings outstretched, its gaze fixed on the horizon. A piece of Westmere, torn and discarded, yet still beautiful, still resilient. She carefully removed it from the branch, her fingers tracing the delicate threads. It was a reminder of her home, of her heritage, of the fight that lay ahead. She tucked it into her pouch, alongside the smooth stone, a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the journey they were undertaking together. It was small, but it felt important. A reminder of home. A reminder of what they were fighting for. Chapter 14. The Gathering Storm. The sun began its descent, painting the sky with hues of orange and purple as Beatrice and Roderick neared the Abbey lands. The forest, though still dense, began to thin, giving way to rolling hills and cultivated fields. They could see the distant spires of St. Michael's Abbey, a beacon of hope in the gathering dusk. But their sense of relief was tempered by a growing unease. The closer they got to their destination, the more vulnerable they felt. They knew that Morton's reach extended far and wide, and that he would stop at nothing to prevent them from reaching the Abbey and exposing his treachery. "We must be extra cautious," Roderick said, his voice low and urgent. "We are entering territory where Morton's influence is strong. His spies could be anywhere." Beatrice nodded, her hand instinctively reaching for the small pouch containing the torn piece of tapestry and the smooth stone, her talismans of hope and resilience. She scanned the landscape, her eyes searching for any sign of danger, any indication that they were being watched. As they rode, they passed a small village, its cottages nestled around a central square. The villagers, preparing for the evening meal, looked up as they passed, their faces curious but wary. Strangers were not common in these parts, and the sight of a knight, even one without the usual retinue, aroused suspicion. Roderick decided to take a calculated risk. He stopped in the village square, dismounted, and approached a group of villagers gathered around a well. "Greetings," he said, his voice calm and friendly. "We are travelers, seeking shelter for the night. Can you direct us to the nearest inn?" The villagers eyed him with suspicion, their faces guarded. They were simple folk, wary of outsiders, especially those who looked like they belonged to the nobility. "There is no one here," one of the villagers said, his voice gruff. "We do not welcome strangers." Roderick remained calm, his demeanor unthreatening.
"We mean no harm," he said.
"We are simply passing through, on our way to St. Michael's Abbey." The mention of the Abbey seemed to ease their suspicions slightly. The monks of St. Michael's were respected throughout the region, known for their piety, their learning, and their charitable works. "The Abbey is still a few leagues distant," another villager said. "It is a long and difficult journey, especially at night." "We are prepared for the journey," Roderick said. "But we would be grateful for any information you can provide. Have you seen any unusual activity in the area? Any strangers passing through?" The villagers exchanged glances, their faces hesitant. They were clearly reluctant to speak, to get involved in matters that might bring trouble upon them. But then an old woman, her face wrinkled and weathered, stepped forward. "I saw them," she said, her voice trembling. "A group of armed men, riding hard, heading towards the Abbey. They wore the colors of Lord Mortine." Beatrice's heart sank. Morton's men were already ahead of them, on their way to intercept Thomas and the document. They were running out of time. Roderick thanked the old woman, his face grim. He remounted his horse, his urgency palpable. "We must ride fast," he said to Beatrice. "Morton's men are close. We have to reach Thomas before they do." They spurred their horses, urging them into a gallop, their hooves pounding on the dirt road. The gathering storm of Morton's treachery was closing in on them, threatening to engulf them in its darkness. The landscape flew past in a blur, the fields and hills giving way to a more rugged terrain as they approached the Abbey. The sky darkened, the clouds gathering overhead, mirroring the turmoil in their hearts. They rode in silence, their thoughts consumed by the race against time, the desperate need to reach Thomas and protect the document, the key to exposing Morton's crimes and clearing their fathers' names. As they crested a hill, they saw it. St. Michael's Abbey, bathed in the last rays of the setting sun, its spires reaching towards the heavens. But the sight, which should have brought them relief, filled them with dread. In the distance, they could see a plume of smoke rising from the Abbey grounds, a dark stain against the twilight sky. And they could hear the faint but unmistakable sounds of battle, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the dying. The Abbey was under attack. Roderick spurred his horse, his face a mask of grim determination. "We are too late," he said, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "Mortine has already reached the Abbey." But Beatrice refused to give up hope. "Thomas is resourceful," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. He will not give up without a fight. We have to get to him. We have to help him. The gathering storm had broken, and they were riding straight into its heart. The peaceful sanctuary had become a battleground, and they were about to be caught in the crossfire. Chapter 15. A Dance of Deception. The sight of smoke billowing from St. Michael's Abbey spurred Roderick and Beatrice to a frantic gallop. The sounds of battle grew louder as they approached, the clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the dying, painting a grim picture of the scene that awaited them. They reached the abbey gates, which lay splintered and broken, a testament to the violence of the attack. Bodies lay strewn across the courtyard, monks and soldiers alike, their blood staining the cobblestones. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, blood, and burning wood. Roderick drew his sword, his face a mask of grim determination. "Stay close to me," he said to Beatrice, "and be ready for anything." Beatrice nodded, her hand reaching for the small dagger she kept hidden in her boot. She had never been in a battle before, but she was prepared to fight, to defend herself, to protect Thomas and the document. They entered the abbey grounds, cautiously navigating the chaos and destruction. Morton's men, clad in his distinctive colors, were everywhere, engaged in fierce combat with the surviving monks. The monks, though outnumbered and outmatched, fought with a desperate courage, defending their home, their faith, their lives. Roderick moved with a practiced ease, his sword a blur of motion as he cut down any of Morton's men who crossed his path. He was a formidable warrior, his skills honed by years of experience, his movements precise and deadly. Beatrice, though lacking Roderick's martial prowess, fought with a fierce determination, using her agility and her knowledge of the abbey grounds to her advantage. She stayed close to Roderick, relying on his protection, but she also did not hesitate to use her dagger when necessary, striking at vulnerable points, defending herself against attackers. They searched for Thomas, their eyes scanning the chaos, their hearts pounding with fear and hope. They called out his name, their voices barely audible above the din of battle, but there was no response. "He must be in the library," Roderick said, his voice strained. "That is where the most valuable documents are kept. It is where he would go to protect the evidence." They fought their way towards the library, a large, imposing building located in the heart of the abbey. The entrance was blocked by a group of Morton's men, guarding the door, preventing anyone from entering or leaving. Roderick charged, his sword meeting the steel of his opponents, his movements swift and deadly. Beatrice followed close behind, using her dagger to fend off attackers, her heart pounding with adrenaline. They fought their way through the guards, leaving a trail of fallen enemies in their wake. They reached the library door, which was battered and scarred, but still holding. Roderick kicked the door open, his sword raised, ready to face whatever lay within. They entered the library, a scene of devastation greeting them. Bookshelves lay overturned, their contents scattered across the floor, torn and burned. The air was thick with smoke and the smell of charred paper. And in the center of the room, a group of Morton's men were surrounding a lone figure, clad in the simple brown robes of a monk. Thomas. He was wounded, his robes stained with blood, but he was still fighting, wielding a heavy iron candlestick as a weapon, his face a mask of defiance. Roderick and Beatrice charged into the fray, their arrival a welcome surprise to Thomas, a terrifying shock to Morton's men. The tide of the battle turned, the two of them, a knight and a fugitive, fighting side by side with the young monk against the overwhelming odds. Roderick's sword danced, a whirlwind of steel, cutting down his opponents with ruthless efficiency. Beatrice, fighting with a desperate courage, used her dagger to stab and slash, protecting Thomas, protecting herself. They fought their way to Thomas's side, forming a protective circle around him. The remaining men of Mortine, outnumbered and outmatched, retreated, fleeing the library, leaving behind a scene of carnage and destruction. Beatrice rushed to Thomas's side, her heart filled with relief and concern. "Thomas, are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I am wounded," Thomas said, his voice weak but steady. "But I am alive." And the document, it is safe. He reached inside his robes and produced the rolled-up parchment, its edges singed but otherwise intact. The key to exposing Morton's treachery, the proof of their father's innocence, was still in their possession. But their victory was short-lived. A voice, cold and menacing, echoed through the shattered remnants of the library. "Well, well, well," Mortine said, stepping out of the shadows, his face a mask of cruel amusement. "What a touching reunion! The traitor's children, reunited at last. And the disgraced executioner, fighting alongside them. How ironic." He was surrounded by a group of his elite guards, their swords drawn, their faces grim and unyielding. They were trapped, outnumbered, outmatched. The dance of deception had reached its final, deadly act. And Beatrice knew that the odds were stacked against them. It seemed this desperate stand was to be their last. Chapter 16. The Lion's Den. Morton's presence filled the ruined library with a palpable sense of menace. He stood tall and imposing, his rich attire contrasting sharply with the devastation around him. His eyes, cold and calculating, fixed on Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick, a predatory gleam in their depths. "I must admit," Mortine said, his voice dripping with sarcasm, "I am impressed. You have managed to elude my men, escape the castle, and even persuade Sir Roderick to join your little rebellion. Quite resourceful for a traitor's brood." Roderick stood protectively in front of Beatrice and Thomas, his sword still raised, his expression defiant. "We're not traitors, Mortine," he said, his voice firm. "You are the traitor. You framed Lord Alaric and Lord Valerius. You plotted against the king, and you have brought ruin upon this sacred place." Mortine chuckled, a low, unpleasant sound. "Such accusations," he said. "Do you have any proof? Or are these merely the ramblings of a disgraced executioner and a pair of desperate fugitives?" Thomas stepped forward, his wounded arm held close to his body, but his voice ringing with conviction. "We have proof," he said, holding up the rolled-up parchment. "This document contains the evidence of your treachery, your plot against the king, your conspiracy with the enemies of the realm." Morton's eyes narrowed, his gaze fixed on the document. He recognized it, Beatrice realized. He knew what it contained, and he knew that it could destroy him. "That document," Mortine said, his voice hardening, "is a forgery. A fabrication created by those who wish to undermine the king's authority, to sow discord and chaos in the realm." "It is the truth," Beatrice said, stepping forward to stand beside her brother. "And we will see that the king hears it." Mortine smiled, a cruel, mocking smile. "The king," he said, "will hear nothing but what I tell him to hear. He is a puppet, a figurehead. I control him, I control the court, I control the realm." "You may control the king," Roderick said, his voice low and dangerous, "but you do not control us. We will fight you, Mortine. We will expose your treachery, and we will bring you to justice." Mortine laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Brave words, Sir Roderick," he said, "but futile. You are outnumbered, outmatched. You have no chance of escape." He gestured to his guards, and they moved forward, their swords raised, their faces grim and unyielding. The circle tightened, closing in on the three of them, trapping them in the lion's den. But then, a voice, unexpected and powerful, rang out from the entrance of the library. "That is enough, Mortine." All eyes turned to the doorway, where a figure stood silhouetted against the fading light. It was King Edmund, his face pale but resolute, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. He was surrounded by his royal guard, their swords drawn, their faces grim. They had arrived, somehow, miraculously, at the very moment when all seemed lost. Morton's face turned ashen, his composure shattered. He had not expected this, had not anticipated the king's arrival. His carefully constructed web of lies and deceit was unraveling before his very eyes. "Your Majesty," Mortine stammered, his voice trembling. "I can explain?" The king said, his voice cold and furious. "Explain why you have attacked a sacred abbey, slaughtered innocent monks, and hunted down the children of a man you falsely accused of treason? They are traitors, your majesty, Mortine insisted, his voice desperate. They are plotting against you, they have forged documents, they are trying to silence. The king roared, his voice echoing through the ruined library. I have heard enough. I have seen enough. He turned to Roderick, his gaze searching his face. Sir Roderick, he said, his voice softer now, filled with a mixture of regret and gratitude. Is it true? Is Mortine the one who framed Lord Alaric and Lord Valerius? Roderick nodded, his head held high. It is true, your majesty, he said. I was there. I was a witness. I was complicit. But I swear to you on my honor, on my life, that Mortine is the true traitor. The king turned to Thomas, who still held the document clutched in his hand. And that document, the king said. What does it contain? It contains the proof, your majesty, Thomas said, his voice steady despite his pain. It details Morton's plot, his conspiracy, his treachery. The king gestured to one of his guards, who stepped forward and took the document from Thomas's hand. The king unrolled the parchment, his eyes scanning the contents, his face growing grimmer with each passing moment. The silence in the library was broken only by the crackling of the burning embers, the dripping of water from the shattered roof, and the heavy breathing of the men who stood poised between life and death. Finally, the king looked up, his gaze fixed on Mortine, his eyes filled with a righteous fury. Mortine, he said, his voice ringing with authority. You are under arrest. You will be tried for treason, for murder, for your crimes against the crown and against the realm. Morton's guards, seeing their master's downfall, hesitated, their loyalty wavering. The king's guard moved forward, surrounding Mortine, disarming him, and binding his hands. The lion, once so powerful, so confident, was now caged, his roar silenced, his claws clipped. And Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick, the unlikely trio who had dared to defy him, stood together, their faces weary but triumphant, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and hope. The scene was one of justice, long delayed, finally arriving. But it was also a scene of profound loss, of lives shattered, of wounds that would take time to heal. The battle was over, but the scars remained. Chapter 17. Flames of Rebellion. The arrest of Lord Mortine marked a turning point, but it was not the end of the conflict. News of his treachery and the king's intervention at St. Michael's Abbey spread like wildfire throughout the realm, igniting smoldering embers of discontent and rebellion. Mortine, despite his capture, still had loyalists, powerful allies who had benefited from his corrupt rule and who were not willing to see their influence and privileges stripped away. These loyalists, scattered throughout the kingdom, began to mobilize, gathering their forces, plotting their revenge, and preparing to challenge the king's authority. They spread rumors, sowed discord, and accused the king of being weak, of being manipulated by the children of a traitor and a disgraced executioner. The realm was on the brink of civil war, the flames of rebellion threatening to engulf the land in chaos and bloodshed. King Edmund, shaken by the events at the Abbey and the revelation of Morton's deep-seated treachery, realized that he had to act decisively to restore order and to assert his authority. He summoned his loyal lords and knights, gathered his forces, and prepared to confront the rebellion head-on. He also knew that he needed the support of those who had been wronged by Mortine, those who had suffered under his corrupt rule. He needed Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick. He sent a royal summons to St. Michael's Abbey, where Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick were recovering from their wounds and assisting with the rebuilding efforts. The summons requested their presence at the royal court, to testify before the assembled lords and knights, to present the evidence of Morton's treachery, and to help the king rally support against the rebellion. Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick, though weary from their ordeal, answered the king's call. They knew that their fight was far from over, that the fate of the realm and their own futures hung in the balance. They traveled to the royal court, escorted by a contingent of the king's guard, their arrival greeted with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and hope. The court was a hotbed of intrigue, of shifting alliances, of whispered rumors and veiled threats. They were brought before the king, who received them with a mixture of gratitude and apology. He thanked them for their courage, for their loyalty, for their unwavering pursuit of justice. He apologized for his past mistakes, for his blindness to Morton's treachery, for the suffering he had unwittingly caused. He then presented them to the assembled lords and knights, a diverse gathering of powerful men, some loyal to the king, some sympathetic to Morton's cause, and some undecided, waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick stood before them, their faces weary but resolute, their hearts filled with a mixture of fear and determination. They told their story, their voices ringing with conviction, their words painting a vivid picture of Morton's treachery, of their father's innocence, of their own struggle for justice. They presented the document, the key piece of evidence, the proof of Morton's plot against the king, his conspiracy with the enemies of the realm. The document was read aloud, its content shocking some, confirming the suspicions of others, and swaying the undecided. But Morton's loyalists, though outnumbered, were not silenced. They challenged the authenticity of the document. They questioned the credibility of the witnesses. They accused Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick of being traitors, of seeking to undermine the king's authority. The debate raged, the arguments heated, the tension in the court palpable. The fate of the realm hung in the balance, dependent on the outcome of this war of words, this battle for the hearts and minds of the assembled lords and knights. Roderick, drawing upon his years of experience as a knight, as a commander, as the king's executioner, spoke with a powerful eloquence, his words cutting through the lies and deception, his voice resonating with authority and conviction. He spoke of his own past, of his own mistakes, of his own guilt, and of his redemption. He spoke of his loyalty to the king, of his commitment to justice, of his determination to see Mortine brought to account for his crimes. His words, combined with the evidence of the document and the testimony of Beatrice and Thomas, swayed the majority of the assembled lords and knights. They declared their loyalty to the king, they condemned Morton's treachery, and they pledged their support to crush the rebellion. The flames of rebellion, though still burning, were beginning to be contained. The realm, though still divided, was slowly beginning to unite against the common enemy. But Beatrice knew that the fight was far from over. Morton's loyalists were still out there, plotting their revenge, waiting for their opportunity to strike. And she knew that she, Thomas, and Roderick would be in their sights, targets of their hatred, their vengeance. The court, for all its finery, was still a dangerous place, and the political maneuverings were as deadly as any blade. Chapter 18. The Weight of Oaths. With the majority of the lords and knights pledging their support to King Edmund, the tide seemed to turn against the brewing rebellion. However, the court remained a viper's nest of intrigue, with Morton's loyalists whispering in the shadows, plotting their next move. The king, aware of the precarious situation, strengthened his guard and kept Roderick, Beatrice, and Thomas close, both for their protection and for their counsel. Beatrice found herself thrust into a world she had long abandoned, the world of courtly life, of political maneuvering, of veiled threats and subtle alliances. She observed the interactions, the whispers, the glances, learning to navigate the treacherous currents of power. She also found herself spending more time with Roderick, their bond deepening amidst the shared danger and the common purpose. One evening, as they walked together in the castle gardens, the scent of roses heavy in the air, Beatrice decided to broach a subject that had been weighing on her mind. "Roderick," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you spoke of your oath to the king, your duty as his executioner. But you also spoke of your guilt, your regret over Valerius's death. How do you reconcile those two, the weight of your oath and the burden of your conscience?" Roderick stopped, his gaze fixed on a distant fountain, its water shimmering in the moonlight. He was silent for a moment, his internal struggle evident in the lines of his face, the tension in his body. "It is not easy," he finally said, his voice low and troubled. "An oath is a sacred thing, a bond that should not be broken lightly. But an oath sworn to a misguided or unjust cause, it becomes a chain, a shackle that binds the soul." "And your oath to King Edmund?" Beatrice asked. Is it a chain or a bond? Roderick turned to her, his eyes searching hers. It was a chain, he said, for many years. A chain forged by fear, by guilt, by a misplaced sense of duty. But now it is becoming a bond. A bond forged by a shared purpose, by a commitment to justice, by a hope for a better future. And your oath to Valerius? Beatrice pressed, knowing that she was treading on sensitive ground. Roderick's face clouded with pain, the memory of his past still haunting him. I broke that oath, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I failed him. I allowed him to die, even though I suspected he was innocent. You were young, Beatrice said, her voice gentle and understanding. You were manipulated just as my father was. You were a victim, too. Perhaps, Roderick said, his voice filled with self-reproach. But that does not excuse my actions. It does not absolve me of my guilt. But it does not condemn you forever, either, Beatrice said. You have a chance to redeem yourself, to make amends for your past mistakes. You are doing that now, by fighting for justice, by helping us expose Morton's treachery. Roderick looked at her, his eyes filled with a gratitude that was almost unbearable. You have given me hope, Beatrice, he said. You have shown me that it is possible to break free from the chains of the past, to forge a new path, to find redemption. They resumed their walk, the silence between them no longer strained, but filled with a shared understanding, a growing affection. But the peace of the garden was shattered by a sudden commotion. A messenger, breathless and disheveled, rushed towards them, his face pale with alarm. Your Majesty, he exclaimed, addressing Roderick with the title he still held, despite his defiance of the king's previous orders. Morton's loyalists they have attacked. They have seized several key castles and towns. They are marching on the capital. The flames of rebellion, which had seemed to be contained, had suddenly erupted with renewed ferocity. The realm was plunged into civil war. Roderick's face hardened, his expression turning grim. We must prepare for battle, he said. We must defend the king, defend the realm, defend the cause of justice. The weight of oaths, both broken and renewed, pressed heavily upon him. He was no longer just the king's executioner. He was a knight, a warrior, a leader, fighting for a cause he believed in, fighting alongside a woman he had come to care for deeply. Beatrice, though frightened by the prospect of war, stood by his side, her own resolve strengthened by his courage, his determination. She knew that the battles ahead would be long and bloody, that the outcome was uncertain. But she was not afraid. She had found her purpose, her strength, her voice. And she would fight, alongside Roderick, for the future of the realm, for the memory of her father, for the hope of a better world. The time for words was over. The time for action had begun. And the weight of their combined oaths, to their families, to their kingdom, to each other, would be tested in the crucible of war. Chapter 19. The Dawn of Reckoning. The news of the rebel attack threw the court into chaos. King Edmund, though shaken, rallied his forces and prepared for a siege. Roderick, drawing upon his years of military experience, took charge of the defenses, organizing the troops, strengthening the fortifications, and preparing for a long and bloody conflict. Beatrice, refusing to be relegated to the sidelines, insisted on contributing to the war effort. She used her knowledge of herbs and healing to tend to the wounded, her familiarity with the castle layout to help with logistics, and her sharp mind to assist Roderick with strategy. She also insisted on weapons training, learning to wield a sword and a bow, determined to defend herself and those she cared for. The siege began with a relentless barrage of catapults and trebuchets, the rebel forces pounding the castle walls with stones and fire. The defenders, outnumbered but resolute, held their ground, repelling wave after wave of attacks. Roderick, a figure of unwavering courage, moved among the troops, inspiring them with his leadership, his skill, his determination. Beatrice, working tirelessly in the makeshift infirmary, tended to the wounded, her hands stained with blood, her heart aching for the suffering she witnessed. She saw the toll of war, the brutal reality of violence, the fragility of human life. But she did not falter, her resolve strengthened by her commitment to the cause, her love for Roderick, her hope for a better future. As the siege wore on, the situation grew increasingly dire. Supplies dwindled, casualties mounted, and the morale of the defenders began to flag. Morton's loyalists, fueled by their hatred and their ambition, pressed their advantage, determined to break through the defenses and seize the capital. One evening, as Beatrice and Roderick stood together on the battlements, watching the enemy campfires burn in the distance, they shared a moment of quiet reflection. "I fear we cannot hold out much longer," Roderick said, his voice weary but resolute. "They outnumber us, and they are relentless." "We cannot give up," Beatrice said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her heart. "We have come too far, sacrificed too much, to surrender now." Roderick looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and affection. "You are a remarkable woman, Beatrice," he said. "You have faced so much adversity, so much loss, and yet you remain strong, courageous, unwavering in your commitment to justice. And you," Beatrice said, her voice soft but sincere, "are a remarkable man, Roderick. You have overcome your past, your guilt, your doubts, and you have become the leader we need, the champion of our cause." They stood in silence for a moment, their gazes locked, their hearts beating in unison. The unspoken bond between them, forged in the crucible of shared adversity, had grown into something deeper, something more profound. But the moment was broken by a sudden shout from a lookout. "They are attacking!" A full assault. On all fronts. The final battle had begun. Roderick drew his sword, his face a mask of grim determination.
"This is it," he said.
"The dawn of reckoning. We fight for our lives, for our freedom, for the future of the realm." Beatrice, drawing her own sword, stood by his side, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was no longer the hunted fugitive, the ghost of Westmere. She was a warrior, a defender, a woman fighting for her beliefs, fighting for her love, fighting for her future. The battle raged, a maelstrom of violence and chaos. The clash of steel, the shouts of men, the screams of the dying, filled the air. The castle walls, battered and scarred, shook under the relentless assault. Roderick fought like a man possessed, his sword a blur of motion, cutting down his opponents with ruthless efficiency. He was a force of nature, a whirlwind of steel and fury, inspiring his men, driving back the enemy. Beatrice, fighting alongside him, matched his courage, his determination. She used her agility, her speed, her knowledge of the castle layout to her advantage, striking at vulnerable points, defending herself and those around her. The battle reached its climax when Roderick faced the leader of the rebel forces, a fierce and brutal knight known as Sir Kellen, a loyalist of Mortine. They clashed in a duel that would determine the outcome of the siege, the fate of the realm. The two knights fought with a savage intensity, their swords meeting with a deafening clang, their bodies straining against each other, their faces locked in a grimace of hatred and determination. Roderick, fueled by his desire for justice, by his love for Beatrice, by his commitment to the king, fought with a strength and skill he had never known before. He parried, he thrust, he dodged, he weaved, his movements precise and deadly. Finally, with a mighty blow, he disarmed Sir Kellen, his sword piercing the rebel knight's armor, ending his life, ending the battle. The remaining rebel forces, seeing their leader fall, lost heart and surrendered. The siege was over. The capital was saved. The rebellion was crushed. The dawn of reckoning had arrived, bringing with it a mixture of victory and loss, of triumph and sorrow. The realm was safe for now, but the scars of war remained, a reminder of the price of freedom, the cost of justice. The sun rose, bloody but bright, over a kingdom exhausted but not defeated. The reckoning was at hand, but so was the rebuilding. Chapter 20. A Crown of Thorns. The victory over the rebel forces brought a fragile peace to the realm, but the wounds of war ran deep. The capital city, scarred and battered, began the slow process of rebuilding. King Edmund, his authority restored, set about the task of healing the divisions within his kingdom, punishing the guilty, and rewarding the loyal. Mortine, stripped of his titles and lands, was brought to trial before the assembled lords and knights. The evidence of his treachery, presented by Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick, was irrefutable. He was found guilty of treason, murder, and conspiracy, and sentenced to death. The execution was carried out swiftly and publicly, a stark reminder of the consequences of betrayal and the price of ambition. Beatrice, Thomas, and Roderick witnessed the event, their faces somber, their hearts filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but the cost had been high. In the aftermath of the trial, King Edmund sought to make amends for his past mistakes, for his blindness to Morton's treachery. He publicly acknowledged the innocence of Lord Alaric and Lord Valerius, restoring their honor and their titles, though it was a gesture that could not bring them back. He offered Beatrice the restoration of her family lands and titles, a chance to reclaim her heritage, to rebuild her life. She accepted, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and trepidation. The weight of responsibility, of rebuilding Westmere, of leading her people, settled upon her shoulders. He also offered Roderick a position of honor at court, a chance to serve as his advisor, his confidant, his friend. Roderick, however, hesitated. The scars of his past, the burden of his guilt, still weighed heavily upon him. He was no longer the king's executioner, but he was not yet sure who he was, what his role should be in this new era. One evening, as Beatrice and Roderick stood together on the balcony of Westmere Castle, overlooking the lands that were once again hers, they spoke of their futures, their hopes, their fears. "I am not sure I am ready for this," Beatrice said, her voice filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. "To be Lady of Westmere, to carry the weight of my family's legacy, to lead my people." Roderick looked at her, his eyes filled with admiration and affection. "You are ready, Beatrice," he said. "You have shown incredible strength, courage, and resilience. You have faced adversity with grace and determination. You are a natural leader, a born protector of your people." "And you, Roderick," Beatrice said, "what will you do? Will you accept the king's offer? Will you remain at court?" Roderick was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "I do not know," he finally said, his voice troubled. "I am no longer the man I was. The king's executioner, the shadow of the gallows. That part of my life is over."
"But you're still a knight," Beatrice said.
"A warrior, a leader, a man of honor. A knight with a tarnished reputation," Roderick said, his voice filled with self-reproach. "A warrior who has carried the burden of guilt for too long. A leader who has made mistakes, who has caused pain. But you have also redeemed yourself," Beatrice said, her voice firm. "You have fought for justice, you have protected the innocent, you have helped to save the realm. You have earned a second chance, a chance to forge a new path, to create a new legacy." Roderick looked at her, his eyes searching hers. He saw not judgment, not condemnation, but love, understanding, and unwavering support. "I have been offered a position," he said, his voice hesitant. "Not at court, but here, in Westmere, as your protector, your advisor, your companion." Beatrice's heart skipped a beat. She had hoped, she had dreamed, but she had not dared to believe that it could be possible. "And what is your answer?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Roderick took a step closer, his hand reaching out to touch hers. "My answer," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache, "is yes.
If you will have me."
Beatrice's eyes filled with tears, tears of joy, of relief, of love. "I will have you, Roderick," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "With all my heart." They embraced, their bodies close, their hearts beating as one. The weight of the past, the burden of guilt, the scars of war, seemed to fade away, replaced by the promise of a new beginning, a new life, a new love. The crown of thorns, the symbol of suffering and sacrifice, had been transformed into a crown of hope, of resilience, of a love forged in the crucible of adversity. Westmere, once a place of shadows and sorrow, was becoming a place of light and healing, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, the unwavering pursuit of justice, and the transformative power of love. The future was uncertain, challenges remained, but Beatrice and Roderick would face them together, their bond unbreakable, their love a beacon of hope in a world that had been touched by darkness. They had earned their peace, and together, they would build a future worthy of the sacrifices they had made. Epilogue. Years passed, and Westmere flourished under Beatrice's wise and compassionate rule. The castle, once a symbol of sorrow and loss, became a haven of peace and prosperity. The lands, once scarred by war and neglect, yielded bountiful harvests. The people, once fearful and divided, were united in their loyalty to their lady and their respect for her protector, Sir Roderick. Beatrice and Roderick, their love deepened by time and shared experience, ruled together, their strengths complementing each other, their wisdom guiding their decisions. They had children, a son and a daughter, who inherited their parents' courage, their compassion, and their commitment to justice. The memory of Lord Alaric and Lord Valerius was honored, their names cleared of the stain of treason, their legacies restored. The story of their unjust deaths and of the brave fight to expose their betrayer became a legend, a reminder of the importance of truth, of courage, and of the enduring power of love. Roderick, no longer the king's executioner, found peace and purpose in his new life. He trained the young men of Westmere in the arts of war, instilling in them not only skill and discipline but also a sense of honor, of justice, of responsibility. He became a mentor, a guide, a father figure to those who had lost their own. Beatrice, no longer the hunted fugitive, embraced her role as Lady of Westmere, her leadership marked by wisdom, compassion, and a fierce determination to protect her people. She established schools, hospitals, and charitable institutions, ensuring that the needs of her people were met, that justice and fairness prevailed. They often walked together in the gardens of Westmere, the scent of roses filling the air, the sound of the fountain a gentle murmur in the background. They would reminisce about their past, about the trials they had faced, about the love they had found, about the future they were building together. One evening, as the sun set, casting a golden glow over the land, Beatrice and Roderick stood on the balcony, overlooking their domain. Their children played in the courtyard below, their laughter echoing through the stillness. "We have come a long way, haven't we?" Beatrice said, her voice filled with a quiet contentment. Roderick nodded, his arm around her waist, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "We have," he said. "From the shadows of the gallows to the light of a new dawn." "And we did it together," Beatrice said, her hand resting on his. "Together," Roderick confirmed, his voice filled with a love that had endured the tests of time, of adversity, of fate. They stood in silence, their hearts filled with gratitude, with peace, with a love that was as strong and enduring as the stone walls of Westmere, as resilient and vibrant as the roses that bloomed in their gardens. Their story, a testament to the power of hope, of courage, of redemption, and of the enduring strength of the human spirit, would be told and retold, a legend whispered through the ages, a beacon of light in a world that often seemed dark and unforgiving. The thorns had given way to roses, and the roses bloomed, bright and beautiful, under a sky that promised a future filled with peace, prosperity, and enduring love. The long, difficult journey had ended, but the legacy of their love and courage would live on, a testament to the enduring power of the human heart. The end.